Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. So I missed what introduction there may have been, but my name is Stacy Simanonok, and I am the East Cascades Oak Partnership Technical Coordinator with Columbia Land Trust. So I am not an Oregon State University affiliate, but I am excited to share with you what I know about oak woodlands and savannas tonight. I have been in my position with Columbia Land Trust for over 2 years now, and I'm based out of our White Salmon Field office, which is just across the river from Hood River, Oregon. I'm going to start off by spending a few minutes explaining what the East Cascades Oak Partnership is for those of you who haven't heard of us. And I will be saying ECOP a lot. That's our abbreviation. So ECOP formed in 2016 as a group of people who recognize the importance of Oregon white oak habitats to our lives, economy, and well-being of hundreds of plants and animals. ECOP has more than 300 individuals from over 25 organizations, including tribes, nonprofits, and federal and state agencies as part of its membership. We partner with both Washington and Oregon organizations. So everyone listed on this slide is considered an ECOP core partner, which means they typically sign the ECOP Declaration of Cooperation, assign a point of contact, regularly attend meetings, and vote on the strategic direction of the partnership. Our mission is to empower people to make decisions and take actions that improve outcomes for Oregon white oak systems. We are funded through state and private grant programs, and we were thrilled to receive a $7.1 million Focused Investment Partnership Award from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board in 2022. Columbia Land Trust is the fiscal and administrative sponsor of the partnership, hosting ECOP's dedicated staff like me. And on this slide also is my coworker, Kat, and my supervisor, Lindsay. And Columbia Land Trust stewards the program's continued success. ECOP serves nearly the full geography of Oregon white oak distribution in the East Cascades ecoregion. It's an area roughly bounded by Yakima Indian Nation to the north, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Reservation to the south, the Cascade Mountains to the west, and the shrub steppe of the Columbia Plateau to the east. For the rest of my presentation, I'm going to focus on Oregon white oak. Oregon white oak is actually Washington's only native oak species, but Oregon has a few other native oaks. Some of the more common ones include California black oak, which extends from California into the Umpqua Valley, as well as canyon live oak, which grows in dry country of southwestern Oregon and also in California. In my area, Oregon white oak is the only native oak species growing and is also the most abundant throughout the state. So I'm going to focus on this oak species in particular for this presentation. I also wanted to give the caveat that some of the examples and information will be specific to the East Cascades region, since that is where my area of expertise is. A brief outline of my talk is first, I will cover some basics of the species and convince you of how awesome they are, go over some brief fire history of this region, and then get into Oregon white oak and how it interacts with fire. I will finish with some examples of fire-adapted and oak-associated species, as well as some topics to consider when implementing fuels reduction or fire activities. The image on the right is showing the range of Oregon white oak from southern British Columbia to northern California, mostly on the west side of the Cascade Mountains. Oregon white oak is a slow-growing species and can live up to 500 years old. I like this quote I found about Oregon white oak: "Planting an acorn now is a gift to your grandkids." And I decided to add to this quote: if it lives to be 250 years old, it's actually a gift to multiple generations of your grandkids. Oregon white oak is fairly adaptable and can grow in diverse climates and on a wide range of soils. This slide is showing 6 different oak system types. Oak savannas in the top left are open with fewer than 10 trees per acre and have grassy and herbaceous vegetative understories. Oak woodlands, shown in the top middle, are denser than savannas, with about 5 to 40 trees per acre, and a mixed understory with open, grassy, and herbaceous vegetation and woody shrub clumps. Oak forests, shown in the top right, typically have at least 75% tree cover and a more closed canopy dominated by oak trees. Mixed oak conifer forest and woodlands, shown on the bottom left, is where oak and conifer are closer to co-dominant, and the stand may be shifting from oak to conifer. This is because oaks are shade intolerant and can be easily overtopped by faster growing conifers. Forests with oak are conifer dominated, and the oaks are patchy or in low numbers in the understory. So that middle bottom photo was taken on the Mount Hood National Forest in the fall. Oregon white oak is leafed out in yellow, hiding underneath the taller conifers. Riparian oak, in the bottom right image, have mixed stands of oaks, various hardwoods, and fewer conifers in ravines and creeks at lower elevations. When ECOP developed the Strategic Action Plan in 2021, we did an extensive GIS mapping exercise to document where oak is predicted to occur in the East Cascades, as shown on this map. You can see that the oak savanna and more open woodlands, which are in the yellow and orange colors, are found in the drier, more eastern extent of Oregon white oak in both Washington and Oregon. And hopefully you can see that the Dalles and Hood River are labeled there. The more western mesic extent is dominated by forests with oak, shown in the dark green color. This map is showing elevation in parts of Oregon and Washington, with the Columbia River Gorge outlined in the white box. There is very little change in elevation along the length of the Columbia Gorge, as it maintains a low elevation, which is shown in a greenish yellow color that might be a little hard to see in this figure. But from the north to south, the elevation ranges from over 11,000 feet at the top of the volcanoes to less than 200 feet on the Columbia River. Gap flow is a phenomenon that develops when there are substantial east-west pressure gradients, which is the case with the Columbia River Gorge. And that's called the gorge gap flow. The gorge gap flow is a major player in defining the weather and climate within and adjacent to the gorge, and is the reason why Oregon white oak established and thrived east of the Cascades when most of its range is in the West Cascades. It is the only place on Earth where a continental scale river like the Columbia River bisects a volcanic mountain range. The annual precipitation here ranges from more than 160 inches to less than 12 inches, all over linear distances of only about 40 miles. This means it feels very different to be in Cascade Locks, Hood River and White Salmon, to Goldendale and the Dalles. And the plants and animals feel this too. Steep gradients mean there's a strong influence of aspect, sun, exposure, fire, and wind. And all of those factors create a patchwork of microclimates and ecotones. Ecotones are the transition areas between two distinct habitat types. For example, where a conifer forest begins to blend into an oak woodland, or where an oak woodland begins to blend into an open grassland. All this to say, this area is a very ecotonal landscape, a fire-adapted one, and a place where both people and animals benefit from the resources oak provides. Oak habitats support over 200 species of wildlife, including the specific tent caterpillar shown on the left, western screech owl, which is inside the big oak cavity, Lewis's woodpecker, adorable western gray squirrels, and hundreds of plant species. Oaks provide important wildlife habitat features with their giant lateral limbs and big cavities for nesting and taking cover from weather or predators. We have large mammals such as this black bear that benefit from the high caloric acorns produced by oaks. And in general, older, larger trees produce more acorns, and oaks can also have masting events, which is when weather conditions allow a mass production of acorns in a growing season. I will get more in depth with acorn production later in the talk. Many other animals benefit from oaks and play an important role in dispersal. Douglas's squirrels, western gray squirrels, blue jays, Steller's jays, and Lewis's woodpeckers disperse acorns. So now I'm going to do our first poll question, which might take me a minute to navigate there. Okay, so which animal disperses acorns farthest from the parent oak tree? Okay, we have about 75% of people have answered the poll. So I think I'm gonna, if I hit end, it will show the result, right? Share result.
Go ahead and click share result.
Okay. So yeah, 63% of people said jays, and then the next most common answer was Lewis's woodpecker, 25%. Okay, so I stopped sharing that. I need to go back to my presentation. Okay. So the answer is that most people were right. It is the jays. A study actually examined how far each animal carried acorns before burying or dropping them. The Douglas's squirrels carried acorns approximately 30 feet before burying them. Blue jays transported acorns almost 1,000 feet before consuming the acorns. Steller's jays typically carried them 1,000 to 1,300 feet into conifer-dominated sites, which I think is just interesting thinking about animals, dispersing oak into areas where they might not be as common. And then Lewis's woodpeckers often transport acorns 100 to 200 feet into Oregon white oak or western juniper-dominated habitats. Sometimes the acorns were dropped, or other times they were consumed. So those of you that guessed jays, you were right. Oaks also provide dropped limbs, and this dead wood on the ground serves as habitat for arthropods, reptiles, and amphibians, and what seems like countless ground squirrels when I am out walking among the oaks. Oak habitats encompass more than just the trees. The plants that make up the understory of oaks are important habitat for wildlife and pollinators, as well as people who have held relationships with some of these species since time immemorial. Oak, woodlands, savannas, and associated prairies have been substantially reduced in both quality and extent in the years since European colonization. The Treaty of 1855 forcibly removed Indigenous people from their homeland and severed lifeways that facilitated frequent lower intensity fire. Over time, how the land was cared for has changed to a culture of fire suppression to protect permanent settlements, forest products, and agricultural crops. In the absence of regular fire, trees, shrubs, and other plants have accumulated across the landscape. Lower intensity fires in the East Cascades historically happened frequently, and the people, animals, and plants living here were attuned to its rhythms. Dry, hot summers and gusty winds carried flames, ignited by summer lightning storms, across tens of thousands of acres annually in the Columbia River Gorge and East Cascades. Scientists and Indigenous elders estimate these fires burned every 5 to 25 years, either from lightning or lit intentionally for cultural burning. A Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs tribal member defined cultural burning as an act of reciprocity. It's an eco-cultural practice of various Indigenous groups that involves the use of low to moderate intensity fire as a means of cultivating materials, food, and spiritual nourishment. It also helps create habitat and restore nutrients and moisture as part of the natural cycle of the landscapes these peoples have known since time immemorial. There have also been academic studies on fire history in this region, which I believe have been covered in previous webinars. But in case you missed that, I'll just go over this one. So a fire history reconstruction study was completed in 2022 across 18 sites on the east side of the Mount Hood National Forest by Dr. Andrew Marshall. Researchers removed cross sections from 10 to 15 fire-scarred stumps or logs at each site. Each tree sampled has a timeline corresponding to the earliest and most recent annual ring present and gives the fire history in between with cambial fire scars. 6 out of the 18 sites were considered warm, dry sites, typical of where Oregon white oak would establish. In this figure, each horizontal line is an individual fire history, and red triangles indicate years of historical fires revealed from those cambial fire scars. Prior to 1900, there were about 8 to 13 fires per century in warm, dry environments. You can also see that fires have been infrequent for the past 120 years, except at site EH15, which is that topmost one, where 4 fires since 1970 can be attributed to prescribed burns and wildfires. The fire history is concentrated from about 1600 to 1900 because that is how long a snag persists. There were a few exceptionally old samples that extended back to almost 1250. And I thought I would pause here to see if there are any questions I should address before going on.
Yes, we have one from Robert. He asked, what are the limiting factors to the range of Oregon white oak?
I guess I would say that, it likes a Mediterranean climate, so precipitation and temperature. And I know it does require like a kind of a summer drought period is also important for it.
We have one other question from Daniel who asked, relative to your observation from the study about how far various animals or wildlife are carrying acorns. He wondered how those observations were made, particularly for how they were observing the birds moving stuff for over 1,000 feet. Do you recall from that particular study?
I don't recall, but that is a good question. And let's see. I might not have put that one in my resources, but we can definitely look that up.
Okay, we'll take a note of that, and that'll be something that we'll put on the website as an answer to that question.
Okay.
And then, so in this particular study, do you recall where Dr. Marshall found the really old trees that date clear back into the 1300s?
I don't, but we could. It looks like say EH30, right? I think it's EH30 or EH29. Although this map doesn't, I guess that's the southern, extent. This is Mount Hood, so kind of the southern easternmost extent.
Yeah. Okay. And AIM asks, he's just referring back to the dispersal of acorns. Did you say that Steller's jays disperse acorns to conifer forest? Is that helpful for oak woodland sustainability?
Yeah, that is what I said, because Steller's jays kind of they prefer more conifer dominated forests, and then we have the California, at least in this area, California scrub jays are more like what I see around town here in White Salmon and more open areas. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting that if a Steller's jay is kind of on that transition zone between a more oak dominated and conifer dominated, it could help push the oak just a little bit more into that conifer dominated area, but there'd have to be an opening, with some sufficient light for the oak to establish.
Great. That's what we have for right now.
Okay. I think I am going to pause at least once more. So, all right. So now we'll get into fire more specifically. Fire is an important process in oak habitats to maintain their structure and understory species diversity, and to prevent encroachment by fire-sensitive competitors. Fire also protects these unique ecosystems from transitioning into forests or shrublands by helping to reduce the density of stands. The photo on the left here is showing a large oak in early stages of conifer encroachment, where it's surrounded by smaller conifers. They aren't big enough yet to have a noticeable impact on the oak tree. However, the photo on the right shows an oak tree with lots of dropped limbs and dead limb scars on the lower part of the trunk. The encroaching conifers were much larger in this example. They were actually just removed as part of a restoration project from around this oak. So that's kind of what you hopefully can see laying down in the ground there. And just here's some more examples. The left photo shows a smaller oak tree being overtopped by a ponderosa pine. However, this is still a fairly open stand, and that pine has actually died, so the oak is receiving enough light to maintain a canopy. The middle photo shows a medium-sized oak surrounded by conifers, and you can see it only has leafy branches at the very top of its crown. And hopefully you can see kind of those dead limb scars on the lower part where it used to have limbs there many years ago. The oak on the right may be too far gone, and it may already be a snag from the reduction in light from the surrounding conifers. Another impact of fire suppression, which I'm sure has been covered in previous presentations in this series, but the increase in dead woody material, both standing and on the ground. This is a photo from Wasco County, Oregon, south of the Dalles, during early spring. So the oaks have not leafed out yet. But this is a good example of how all this material can increase fire risk and could put the remaining live oak trees at risk from fire. And this is a site that's actually currently undergoing a restoration treatment funded through ECOP's FIP award. So I guess I didn't go into that, but as part of that award, we are partnering with multiple agencies to do restoration projects on thousands of acres. We are seeing a lot of pine mortality in the easternmost extent of Oregon white oak, and this can sometimes cause direct impacts to oaks. In this case, when the pine tree fell over and crushed the oak. The amazing thing is this oak may very well grow new sprouts from its base to compensate for losing its crown. Generally, oaks are fire resistant. They have a protective, quirky bark structure, which can sometimes be 2 to 3 inches thick. They also have deep tap roots and heat-tolerant buds, which can resprout after fire, as shown on the photo on the right. A wildfire came through the Mosier area in July of 2024. And when we toured the area in November, some of the oaks were already resprouting with the start of fall and winter precipitation events. On the left, we can contrast fire scars between conifer and oak. The conifer may have had a taller char height due to the dripping resin, but in general, char heights are fairly low on oaks. Oak leaves are also less likely to burn with their reduced resin content. Despite oak's protective fire-resistant features, it is not completely immune to fire. As a younger tree, it survives fire with live underground roots while the top may be dead. In the next growing season, the tree will often sprout new branches at bud sites on the stem and at the tree's base. The larger and older trees do not typically experience full top kill from fire, but instead some branches in the crown may die back. The condition of these oaks in these photos may be aesthetically unpleasant to people, but fire-induced top kill and crown dieback can help to thin dense stands, as well as provide snags and downed wood for wildlife habitat. These photos are from the Klickitat Canyon, where a wildfire burned around 2010. The photo on the left is from 2013, where you can see the fresh green sprouts at the base of the oaks. And the photo on the right is from 2023. It's a slightly different angle, same area though. It's in the spring when the oaks haven't leafed out yet, but you can see how they have matured into tall shrub or sapling forms. Without regular low-intensity fire, we become concerned about greater fuel loadings, woody plant encroachment, and accumulated forest floor depth around the bases of mature oaks. Unfortunately, sometimes hot fire can burn down larger oaks. Oaks often have deep cavities or even hollow bases, as shown here in this prescribed fire area on the right. That photo was during a prescribed burn that took place outside Goldendale, Washington, and the fire practitioner was actively removing embers from within the hollow base to prevent the tree from dying, and he was successful. These large old oaks are often referred to as legacy oaks. They are magnificent trees with big cavities, deep fissured bark, huge limbs, and provide many benefits to wildlife. This is an example of one we found while touring the Microwave Tower Fire, which was a wildfire that burned in July of last year in the Mosier area. Despite fire going up into the inside of this tree, it appears it will survive. However, other oak trees did succumb to this wildfire, like this one on the left that toppled over after fire burned its base. The photo on the right shows a large riparian oak that experienced a hot burn during a wildfire in eastern Klickitat County in Washington. The neighboring landowner referred to this tree as the grandfather oak and has been observing the tree and plant recovery in the area since the wildfire. He provided us with a pre-fire photo. Sorry, that is a little bit blurry, but this was a seasonal stream corridor. You can see that large legacy oak, but it was surrounded by willow and hawthorn thickets, which burned extremely hot. And we just received an update from this landowner about this site. Hi, Lenny, if you're on the call. He confirmed the big oaks did not survive the fire. He has a hopeful view that the oak has now become a magnificent snag for Lewis's woodpeckers and other wildlife. There are some oak and willows coming back in other areas, but unfortunately, there's also an abundance of weeds coming back. On the other hand, sometimes the large oaks survive fire, like this oak did during a prescribed fire near Goldendale. Or the photo on the right, which I love, it shows a concerned private landowner spraying water around a legacy oak on the side of Highway 197 during the Larch Creek wildfire that happened this previous summer. To help restore Oregon white oak ecosystems, managers have increased their use of prescribed fire with the goals of reducing stand density, reducing down woody and leafy material, and increasing the amount of bare ground for native plant species to grow. This is a video of a prescribed burn last fall on Columbia Land Trust property near Goldendale, Washington, in a mixed oak pine woodland. Land managers were expecting a lower intensity burn because of the large spacing between the trees and little to no ladder fuels, but it burned hotter due to all the accumulated pine needles and duff. Even though it burned hotter than expected, I think land managers are still happy with the outcomes and are feeling grateful they have reduced the fuel loading. And they're going to continue to monitor the post-fire recovery of this site. There has been some research on how oaks respond to the reintroduction of fire. A paper from 2019 assessed how prescribed fire at Joint Base Lewis-McChord impacted a variety of sized oaks. They observed minimal top kill of oaks after fire, even with high levels of crown scorching. The figure here shows the diameter distributions of living, dead, and top killed oaks, 9 months, which is shown in panel A, and 15 to 25 months after prescribed fire, shown in panel B. You can see the majority of trees remained alive, shown in green. Some experienced top kill, which is shown in black, and very few oaks actually fully died, which is that tiny part in orange. More than 90% of oaks experience some level of scorching. They found that trees with greater quantities of crown scorch were more likely to experience dieback the following spring, and tree size was a limiting factor in the model. There was very little crown foliage consumption, meaning very few oak leaves and branches actually burned completely. Larger oaks appeared to be better able to withstand a high level of scorching. The larger oaks are taller, so their aerial buds are protected from heating. And increased diameter oaks typically have greater bark thickness, which offers more protection from fire. So the top-killed trees had a mean DBH, that's diameter at breast height, of 11.3 centimeters, which is about 4.5 inches. And trees with live above ground vegetation had a mean of 21.6 centimeters, or 8.5 inches. This paper is included in the resources I provided. Here's another example of prescribed fire in a mixed oak pine woodland. This prescribed fire was on the east side of the Mount Hood National Forest near Rock Creek Reservoir and occurred in May of 2023. ECOP employed contractors to conduct pre and post-treatment monitoring on 15 plots within this area using our disturbance monitoring protocol. 6 out of 15 monitoring plots ended up experiencing the burn. And in those monitoring plots, we found no changes to stand density, which is perhaps to be expected with a low intensity prescribed burn. And then we also found an increase in bare ground and a noticeable oak sprout regrowth. ECOP has also developed a post-fire severity monitoring module that is ideally implemented about 2 weeks after fire comes through an area. This module assesses variables like scorch height, char height, and burn severity of soils within our standard 50-foot radius plots. Just talk a little bit more about shrubby oaks. So the left photo is from May of 2023 from the Mount Hood National Forest prescribed fire. And the other 2 photos are from September 2023 when I visited the site. At that point, the majority of the smaller oaks were resprouting with fresh green leaves. The photo on the right shows an oak that had been cut many years ago and resprouted after being cut. Those sprouts grew about 3 to 4 feet tall. The prescribed fire killed those stems, but the oak resprouted with fresh green sprouts at the base less than 6 months later. While it's generally, I think, positive that oaks can resprout following fire, we are left wondering how long it will take these shrubby oaks to escape this growth form and grow into tall legacy oak that provides important resources. If an area experiences repeated cutting or fire, it might take a while for these shrubby oaks to actually reach reproductive age. A paper by Peter and Harrington from 2022 examined the characteristics influencing acorn production by surveying a variety of oak trees across age classes. And I'm going to do another poll question. I saw someone this popped up, so I'll just answer it. What is top kill? Top kill's when like the above ground part of the tree dies, but the roots are still alive underground. And then and how you know that, I guess, is like the next year, or later it resprouts with fresh stems from that same root system. Okay, so this question, what is the average age of acorn production in Oregon white oak? I have a pretty good distribution of answers here. Give a few more seconds. Okay, so 17% said 10 years, 43% said 20 years, 36% said 50 years, and 4% said 75 years. Okay. Okay, so the answer is 20 years. That's what they found. And it actually plateaued around 80 years of age. The oldest tree in the study was over 300 years old, actually produced no acorns. They also found that open-grown trees growing in well-drained, loamy soils had the highest productivity within natural settings. Their study also looked at how acorn production varied with how long it had been since a disturbance event like fire. The trees underburned 6 to 10 years before the survey produced more acorns than trees not underburned or trees underburned more recently. Further studies by these authors have looked at synchrony of acorn production across geographic areas in the Pacific Northwest and how it's associated with weather. They found a high degree of synchrony across large geographic areas, which suggests large-scale weather phenomena directs acorn production. Acorn production in the Puget-Willamette Trough was negatively correlated with spring precipitation. So a wetter spring meant fewer acorns that fall. There was also an effect of winter temperature, where warmer temperatures meant fewer acorns the following year. This does make us wonder if climate change is pushing us towards a warmer fall, how that may affect acorn production into the future. And yeah, I just thought I'd pause here to see if there's questions. And also just check in if you hear background noise on my end or if it's okay.
You're doing just great noise-wise.
Okay, good.
So Dean asks, what restoration projects have been most successful? Are oak planted sometimes as acorns or seedlings?
Yeah, so a lot of the restoration projects that we're involved with are mainly like conifer thinning, so just reducing that competition from the oaks, or for fire risk, just kind of like that photo I showed where all that dead down wood was all tangled, just reducing the fire risk in those stands. So we actually are, we aren't planting acorns as any of those studies. But I can say that ECOP has produced an acorn planting guide. It's kind of a simple one-pager that we can share out. And we actually recommend planting acorns instead of seedlings. Seedlings have, they have a long taproot and it's kind of hard to transplant that and keep it safe. So actually seeding acorns is a really easy thing to do and fairly successful.
And Amanda asks, she says she has lots of oak areas that have conifer encroachment and lots of dead and dying ponderosa pine within those. Are there professional resources that private landowners can take advantage of to get kind of technical assistance on how to go about doing restoration in these sites?
Yes, I'd be curious what part of the state Amanda is in Washington or Oregon. I'd say I would definitely reach out to ODF. I know at least in this area, there are projects going on that provide funding and support to private landowners. So depending on where Amanda lives, there might be active programs going on. You're welcome to contact the East Cascades Oak Partnership too. If you're in this area, we'd be happy to lend some advice too.
Amanda says she's southwest of the Dells, so she probably is within your area.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, they're actually just starting I guess it depends on exactly how far southwest you are, but they have a CWDG grant where they are actively starting fuels reduction and defensible space work. So yeah, Amanda, actually, if you wouldn't just mind emailing me after, that'd be great.
And Marilyn asks, is when you talked about the shrubby oak, is that just Oregon white oak or is it a different oak species? We have some shrubby oak species throughout the
Yeah,
region.
we have found that that is actually a common question that people have. Like a lot of people actually think that shrubby oak that I showed pictures of is a different species, but it's not. Those are still Oregon white oak. It's just, they can have just such different growth forms, that majestic mushroom shaped oak is like, I think what a lot of people think of. But, they can turn into that shrubby growth form. They can, out here in the Columbia River Gorge is all this wind. And so they can have these really short statured appearances. There is I'm not from the Southwest Oregon part, but I'm pretty sure there is a different species of oak that is considered a shrub, but I'm not sure the name off the top of my head.
Daniel asks, what's the maximum soil temperature that oaks can survive during a fire event? And does it
Ooh.
compare to conifers? Do you want to take a stab at that?
I do not know the answer to that.
So
If anyone else does, yeah.
I will take a bit of a stab at it and just say that, Daniel, a lot of that depends on whether that particular tree, and it really boils down to the particular tree, not as much the species. If that particular tree has a lot of its fine roots located towards the upper soil surface, like within the first inch or maybe 2 inches of the soil surface, that's where they're likely to see heat damage from a fire. And the amount of heat damage from the fire is going to depend on the depth of the litter and duff layer. That's the stuff that really can burn slow enough to have a long enough residence time to heat up the soil. If we have, flashier fuels like grass or even shrubs, the fire tends to move through fast enough that it doesn't do a whole lot of soil heating. And then what really defines whether that tree dies or not from the root damage is whether it's already under stress from other things, and then do we add enough stress to it from killing those fine roots that you kind of push it over the edge. And often you don't see that immediately. You see it a year or two or three or four later as a result of typically bark beetles moving into that stressed tree. So there's kind of a cascade of effects that happen there. Part of the issue that we see with areas that have been deprived of fire for a significant amount of time is they build up a deeper duff layer, and then not only does that mean that you'll have a longer burning fire to heat soil, but also often these trees, because that's where the moisture is, they'll end up putting a significant portion of their fine roots into that duffy layer. It's particularly true of ponderosa pine, but I imagine so for oak as well. And so that's where you can have that kind of combination of effects where you start seeing a lot of root mortality. So, okay, so Liz asks, are there prescribed burn services available for private property owners? She's in Appleton in Klickitat County.
Oh, that is really exciting because the Mount Adams Prescribed Burn Association just formed in the last 1 to 2 years, I'd say. Columbia Land Trust is a major player in that, along with the Mount Adams Resource Stewards. So they have a great website. You should definitely check it out. Somebody hopefully can put that in the chat for me, something like mountadamspba.org. And yeah,
We'll
that
ask
would,
Carrie to do a little research and pop that into the chat for us.
yeah. Yeah, so they're Washington focused, but I know things are underway to get a PBA hopefully established kind of in the Oregon side of this region at least.
Yeah, I think there are discussions going on in the kind of Hood River area, so there could be
Yep.
some more opportunities there as well. Yeah. Um, do you know if fires have impact on the amount of mistletoe that might be found in oaks?
I do not know. I have actually only seen mistletoe in oaks once, a roadside oak near Friend, Oregon. So I think mistletoe, at least here, is just not very common in oaks. So I don't know the answer to that.
That it's interesting you make that observation because I spent many, many years working in southwestern Oregon, and the oaks have lots of mistletoe,
Huh,
right?
yeah,
But you're right.
interesting.
Now that I think about that being in the Hood River area, I don't see it there, and so it's just not
Yeah,
as common there. I do know that fire can be something that mitigates the prevalence of dwarf mistletoe in conifer species, but I've not
mm,
seen a particular study that looked at how it impacts mistletoe in oaks. So that's a very interesting question. We just don't know the answer to that right now. Do
yeah.
you happen to know, this was a question from Richard, are the fire scars on oak similar to ponderosa pine? And like they have a similar amount of time that they take to recover from that? Because the ponderosa pine, part of the reason we can so effectively cross date is it kind of continually grows over those fire scars and embeds them in the new wood. I just wonder if you have any information on like whether there's been fire scar reconstructions and things done in oaks.
I don't have a great answer for that, but I can tell you that oaks are really hard to core and age. So I think a lot of times, they're just not the best choice when I think I heard that in a previous presentation that, I think you said, John, maybe that the ponderosa pine are kind of the key species for doing those fire reconstruction studies. So I'm not sure about oaks. Um,
Yeah, there's been lots of reconstruction studies done using ponderosa pine. There's been quite a bit now done using Douglas fir. Douglas fir, older, big old Douglas fir stumps will retain those scars. I just don't know what they would do in oak. I've not looked at that
yeah,
and haven't talked to Andrew about that. So Dr. Mercer would be the expert and kind of bring us that information. So we
yeah, I
could,
think we just use, I would use the pines that are usually there are some
yeah.
pines growing within oaks, even in the, when I talked about oak savannas or oak woodlands, there's still an occasional pine here and there. So I think you can just infer from the pines.
And Marilyn asks, what's the scientific name for Oregon white oak?
Quercus gariana.
There we go. Good job.
Somebody can write that in the chat and spell it correctly.
And do you happen to know if the mistletoes that occur in oak is that one species or are there multiple species of mistletoe?
I think it's only one species. There's actually a USDA field guide of, I'm not sure, I'm not getting the title quite right, but USDA field guide of Oregon, of oak insects and diseases. I think it's from California, but that's kind of the resource that we use to look up any like pest and I know it has information about mistletoe. So I
Yeah.
would check that resource out.
Yep, that's a very good resource. And you may cover this later, so maybe we'll put it off, but AIM is wondering if you know anything about like the market for oak wood as a driver for any of the restoration work. Could some of this be used for marketable products?
Um, I'm not going to cover that, so I'll try and answer it now. I think there's not really a good market for it. I know it makes good firewood, but I think most of what people are removing are conifers. I will just mention that ECOP is doing a kind of special monitoring study where we're comparing the physiological response of oaks to different thinning treatments. And so we are looking at kind of, because that is a big question here, like, you can have a pretty dense stand of oaks. Is it a good idea to thin around and kind of give some of the medium or larger size oaks more room to breathe? Or are those oaks, kind of forming a protective feature around each other? And so we just collected our baseline data last year across 3 sites in Wasco County, collaborating with a researcher from Cal Poly Humboldt, OSU, and NRCS. So we're really, yeah, the treatment, like that photo I showed where I said restoration's happening, that's one of our sites. The treatments are ongoing this winter, and we're really excited to go back out this August and measure the physiological response again and see what's happening.
Great. And I would just add to that that if people are interested in thinking about market opportunities for Oregon white oak or wanting to obtain it, you can go to the Oregon Forest Industries directory. I think I stated that right. We can drop that in the chat box. That's a site that one of our colleagues at OSU maintains that shows where the different mills are for different products. And there are a few specialty mills in Oregon that process Oregon white oak. It's pretty commonly used for making lumber, particularly for flooring. It's a really good flooring material because it's very dense. There's also some folks that have experimented with using it to make wine barrels because it's a closed pore oak species, and so it'll produce wine barrels. And so there's been some work with that. Yep, my name just said that, wine barrels. Okay, so that's what we've got to add to that, and that concludes the questions that are in the queue for right now. So what else have you got for us, Stacy?
Okay, low to moderate intensity wildfire and cultural burning have been a regular feature of the East Cascades oak landscape since time immemorial. Many plants and animals here are adapted to fire. So I'm going to go through a few examples. Ceanothus is a shrubby species with dormant ground stored seed that requires heat to germinate. Snowbrush ceanothus in particular also sprouts vigorously from the root crown after fire, as shown in the photo. The fire creates conditions more favorable for snowbrush ceanothus growth by removing the overstory, meaning this shrub shows a marked increase in burned forest areas due to heat scarification of seed, sprouting, and increased light. The fresh green growth on ceanothus after a fire is an excellent resource for foraging animals like deer, just putting a positive light on that. Another fire-adapted species is Lewis's woodpecker, which is the bird species used in our ECOP logo that I love. They are aerial insectivores during spring and summer, meaning they need an open canopy to swoop down in and catch insects. They're also cavity nesters that use well-decayed snags for breeding. So for these reasons, Lewis's woodpeckers are considered burn obligate species that benefit from patchy burned areas, creating ideal habitat for them. Mixed oak pine woodlands are a common oak system type, and ponderosa pine, like oak, is a fire-adapted species. I know that John covered the unique features of ponderosa pine in the dry forest presentations a couple weeks ago, but in case you missed that one, I wanted to briefly mention that species since it's often co-occurs with oak. Ponderosa pine is also a shade-intolerant species like oak and regenerates most successfully after disturbances that open the canopy and expose bare mineral soil. And fire is the primary agent that creates these conditions. Ground fires that burn thick duff and coarse woody debris can damage or kill roots, like what John was just saying, and may result in higher ponderosa pine mortality than would be expected based on the above ground injuries you can see after the fire. And just know that the post-fire mortality may be delayed for several years and may also be exacerbated by drought and bark beetle attacks. Next up is creeping barberry, which is a species within the Mahonia genus. You may have heard of Oregon grape. So fire top kills creeping barberry, so meaning it kills the above ground structure, but it has the ability to sprout from rhizomes after fire. This species may be killed by severe fire, however, that removes the duff and heats the soil, which kills the rhizomes. So therefore, it's considered to have a medium resistance to fire. But this is something I've seen sprouting up readily after prescribed fire and wildfire in this area. Okay, I have another polling question, but not a Zoom poll. Just if you want to put your answer in the chat. Can anyone guess what this species is that burned in a wildfire outside Mosier? And you'll have to let me know what people are saying since I can't see. Does anybody have any guesses?
The poison oak? Alder. That's what's come in so far. I think you've stumped people.
Ooh, yeah, I mean, I was stumped when I saw this. This is balsam root. A literature review of arrowleaf balsam root describes the fire survival strategy as regrowth from a surviving thick caudex, and state it will survive even the most severe fire, an increase in frequency and density after fire. I really couldn't believe that this was balsam root when I saw it, but the botanist from the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Area assured me it was. I am really excited to revisit this spot later this spring and see how the balsam root in this area is recovering. But this botanist had no worries. He was actually excited that the fire had come through this area. Fire suppression, increased disturbance, and other factors have led to the expansion of novel species, such as invasive annual grasses like cheatgrass, ventonata, or medusa head. A more intact native understory looks like the images on the left, with clumps of perennial bunch grasses and native forbs growing in between. The open spaces between bunch grasses is important because it allows for new plants to establish through seed-soil contact. It also provides habitat for ground nesting bees. On the other hand, invasive annual grasses can form a dense monoculture that increases fuel loading and fire risk. I know that land managers are struggling with balancing multiple objectives. For example, you might want to use prescribed fire with the goal of reducing fuel loads and promoting forest health, but you might also fear the expansion of invasive annual grasses with the use of fire. I'm not sure I have an answer to that, just that be aware and make sure you're monitoring and prepared for the expansion of invasive annual grasses. I wanted to give you some key takeaways for oak and fire. First, you should expect that many oaks, especially younger ones, will resprout after prescribed fire or wildfire. As we discussed, this shrubby growth form may or may not be desired, depending on your point of view. Another point is that oak leaf litter is fire resistant. Practitioners implementing prescribed burns in the wetter shoulder seasons have reported difficulty getting the desired fire behavior because the oak leaf litter is so fire resistant. Another takeaway is if conducting a prescribed burn, consider taking efforts to protect legacy oaks. Before burning, you can identify trees or large pieces of coarse wood on the forest floor you would like to protect. Some strategies to protect individual trees, snags, or coarse wood include clearing plant material and duff from around the base, digging a line around it, back burning, wetting, or even screening large cavities in oaks to prevent embers from entering. Frequently patrol your mature oaks during and after a burn to suppress any embers that get a hold. They can be extinguished with water and effort. And final takeaway is that invasive annual grasses respond favorably to disturbances like fire and are more flammable than native perennial grasses. Consider seeding perennial grasses into burned areas where invasive annuals are present, or follow your burn with fall herbicide treatments to target those fast germinating seeds. Fuels reduction is another hot topic these days, so I just wanted to provide a few points for you to think about. One is to use a patchy, clumpy approach to minimize wildfire spread while also retaining important habitat features. You can conduct more aggressive treatments near infrastructure and leave some pockets of denser shrubs, snags, and large pieces of downwood for wildlife farther from homes. The second point is to retain native fire-adapted species like ponderosa pine and Oregon white oak when possible. Mature trees of these species are more resistant to flames than other species and naturally moderate fire behavior. Also consider retaining large, low-hanging oak branches that have healthy foliage. Oak trees can and do catch fire in extreme conditions, on steep, windy slopes, or when surrounded by other fuels. But we've also seen green oak branches just feet from flaming hot fuels resist ignition. Remove more flammable fuels from around these features, and they'll likely be just fine. I also encourage you to think about the effect your fuels reduction treatments may have on the understory growing beneath the oaks. By limiting soil disturbance when using machinery, you are set up better to retain and protect fire-adapted native species in the understory. Tracked machinery causes soil disturbance that weeds love. And some of our weeds are more flammable than our fire-adapted native plants and can create a carpet of connected fuels that increase fire spread. The final point is to identify the grasses and plants in your stand before selecting a treatment method, and consider how they may be impacted by the method you select. Where the soil is disturbed, it's a good idea to seed with native grasses and forbs if available. Before wrapping up, I wanted to share some information about the Pacific Northwest Oak Alliance. This alliance is a way multiple oak partnerships across the states of Oregon, Washington, California, and British Columbia can share strategy, secure funding, and advocate for oak policy with one voice. We just recently launched a website. You should go check that out, especially if there is an oak partnership in your area. There's a webpage on there focusing on the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which I linked in the resources as well. And of course, we welcome you to join the ECOP community, especially if you're in our area. You can sign up for our newsletter by emailing oaks@columbialandtrust.org. We are also developing our very own website that will be full of regional information, have all of our monitoring and assessment protocols, contain very detailed management guidance, and more. The website is in the bottom there. It is not live yet. Our website designers are working really hard right now. We're hoping it will go live around May. So please keep that website in mind in the future. And that's all I had.
Awesome. We've got a few more questions if you're willing to take them.
Mm-hmm.
When you're out in your oak forest looking around, how often do you see pileated woodpeckers?
Maybe not that often. I'm trying to think of where I've seen them.
So they are more common in moist forests, but they do
Yeah,
like hardwoods within those moist forests. And so I've seen them in oak that are in a little bit more moist concept. When you get in these really dry forests, I don't think they're as there much, but it just there was a
yeah,
question and I was curious what you've observed.
yeah. I know I see them a lot down by the river, actually, just near Underwood. There's just, I don't know, I guess a spot they like there. But yeah, I think the other times I've seen them have been that transition between oaks and conifers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if I was a woodpecker, I would much rather peck away at a cottonwood down in the riparian zone than one
Yeah,
of the hard old oak trees. That sounds like
yeah.
a um this is an interesting question. So when we're in oak areas west of the Cascades, very often there's also poison oak there. Do you find poison oak in your oak areas east of the Cascades?
Definitely in the gorge. But yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like it's super concentrated in the gorge on maybe primarily the south, like the Oregon side. But it is not on the Mount Hood National Forest. Like I have not seen it there. So yeah, it's only kind of in the gorge that I know of, which is really interesting.
One of
And
my observations, whoops, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say um oh actually yeah, I'm thinking of a spot that the Washington DNR did a restoration treatment kind of north of White Salmon, where they removed a lot of encroaching conifers from around oaks, and there was an increase in poison oak. So yeah, poison oak likes that increase in light.
Yeah, and one of the observations that I've made, I don't know how legitimate it is, but I have been in lots of forests and I do a lot of search and rescue stuff. So I'm in lots of places back in the woods, and I've observed that I almost never find poison oak above 3,500 feet in elevation. So that may be part of the reason you're not finding it on Mount Hood because that's higher elevation. But so I'm just thinking there's some climatic or temperature limit that it's got to have those warmer sites in order to remain. So
Mhm.
could be. Um, so you mentioned synchronicity of acorn production. And Leslie was wondering, does that apply to all kind of acorn production, or is that really related to mast years?
I think all acorn production. So the graphs in the study, were like had multiple years and that they measured it, and so you could just kind of see the line go up and down. They had sites out here in the East Cascades and in the Puget area, and they all kind of followed a general pattern. I didn't put the specifics of the East Cascades. It seemed like there were slightly more complicated factors going on there that I didn't want to get into, but yeah.
Alyssa asks, you were talking about the Mahonia species, and she wonders if all of the Mahonia species resprout after fire, or just the Nervosa repens that you were looking at there, that are the low-growing ones.
Um, that was not the Nervosa that I was showing. Or yeah, Repens, yeah. Um, I found that information on the fire effects information system. Is that what that stands for?
Yep, FEIS. Yep.
Yeah. And I did not see an entry for Oregon grape, which is Mahonia aquifolium, but I'm assuming they all kind of respond similarly.
I've seen them resprout after wildfire
Yeah.
in West Side forests where I more commonly see that. But yeah, I think that
Yeah.
those Mahonias have a pretty good capacity to resprout. They're pretty good sprouting species. So unless you had a really long, kind of slow smoldering fire that really could put a lot of heat down deep, that'd be a species that I would expect would resprout, I would think.
Mhm.
And then one last question. You were mentioning exotic grasses growing in, and Don wonders if those grass species are allelopathic. Do they release chemicals that prevent other grasses and other plants from growing, or are they just a competitive factor?
Um, I think it's just competitive. I feel like I have not seen um, information about alleliopathic effects. I think they're just, yeah, they produce that, they're annuals, they grow really densely, their stems have more silica, so they don't break down as easily. That's why they produce that thick thatch, and it just prevents other native species from being able to germinate up through it.
And that is my understanding as well. I'm not the expert on invasive grasses, but that's my understanding as well. We have a lot of things that do have allelopathic responses. We talked about juniper potentially having some of that. I've certainly observed an allelopathic response to Himalaya berry, which is really common invasive species in some of our west side forests. We'll find it even in our east side forests, particularly in the gorge. So there are definitely some allelopathic invasive species, but I don't necessarily think the grasses are that. So, all right. So that's what we had tonight. Stacy, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Lots of fantastic information, and it's great all the work that you guys are doing, and just having a resource to go to think about how we can do restoration in these really important forests. So thanks for all your great work. And with that, I'm going to ask Jake to give us our keyword for SAF people tonight.
Yeah, tonight's keyword is oaks. And I just put that in the chat as well.
Awesome. Great. So thank you, everyone. And Stacy, thank you again. Such great information. And we just really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. But we also appreciate all of those of you who joined in tonight. Thanks for being with us throughout this series. We've all learned a ton. What a great bunch of information. And remember that the website will be active indefinitely. I can't say it's going to be there permanently. Nothing's ever permanent, right? But it's there as long as we can keep maintaining those and having access to host those. And so as soon as we get the recording back from this, we'll get it posted there, and it'll be available for you to share and use in your ongoing education. Stacy, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. And I just put my email in the chat if anyone wants to directly email, or that Oaks at Columbia Land Trust goes to my coworker, Kat, and she can pass along anything that comes into me. She's also the one that will sign you up for our e-news if you're interested in that.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
All
Good
right,
night.
thanks. Bye.